Bulavanaka, kia ora, and welcome to the second and final day of the Pacific Indigenous Peoples and Climate Crisis Workshop, Lessons from the Frontlines. And we are currently at session 3 for the workshop, the role of technology in climate mitigation and adaptation. My name, for those who have perhaps just joined, is Catherine Murupaenga-Ikenn, and I come from the Māori peoples of Ngāti Kuri and Te Arawa in the North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So our first speaker I'd like to introduce for you for this session is Professor Elisabeth Holland, and she is the director of the Pacific Centre for Environment and Sustainable Development at the University of South Pacific. And her topic will be on a technology known as geoengineering or climate engineering. So Professor, we'd like to hand it over to you.
Thank you all very much. I'm really honored to be here today. I have been focused on this area of climate change and geoengineering for some time. But really the intent today is just to remind us that we're all paddling one canoe on our one ocean, and we have only this one planet to live on. And I think it's that sense of shared mission that makes me so honored to be here today. And I am afraid that I'm a scientist, and I have been working for now 2 decades to weave together scientific information and Indigenous knowledge. And in the report that's shown here, which is an Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, we were able to really make a very strong argument for weaving together Indigenous knowledge with traditional scientific knowledge to create a whole story for the Pacific and for our oceans. And one of the key findings of this, which is one that I thought we needed to know very much about, is what's happening with sea level rise. We have our daily experience of sea level rise and storm surge from our recent tropical cyclones, whether it was from Tropical Cyclone Sarai, Tropical Cyclone Harold, Tropical Cyclone Ana, or Tropical Cyclone Iese. In each of those tropical cyclones, we end up with a great deal of storm surge, as we had with Winston. As a scientific community, one of the things that keeps happening is our estimates of what sea level rise will be in the future keeps rising. So now, as the result of this latest report, we're at 5.4 meters of sea level rise for the high emission scenario. And so that means that if we continue to do what we've been doing, which is using fossil fuels, emitting them to the atmosphere, and having that be trapped and trap the heat, we're going to end up with an even worse problem. When I first came to the Pacific a decade ago, I was using a single paddle to demonstrate where we would be with sea level rise by the end of the century. Now we're looking at as much as we went to 3 meters of sea level rise, so half of my paddling team. And now at 5.4 meters of sea level rise, we need all 6 paddles of our paddling team to be able to describe where we will be in 2300. So the voices of the Pacific keep arguing that we have a problem, and the voices of the scientific community keep arguing that we have an even bigger problem than we thought we had. And this is of serious concern for our coastal communities. And I have some other sobering news, is that we as a scientific community could be wrong. It could be even worse. So there's a 10% chance that we're wrong, and we're looking at as much as 30 to 50 meters of sea level rise by 2300. So I hope that we're not wrong, but this is why we need the urgency of Indigenous voices, Pacific leaders, and all of us speaking together. So because the problem is so urgent, the scientific community is going down its usual technological solution path, and it gets very complicated very quickly. So right now we have 3 different areas of what's called climate engineering or geoengineering, excuse me. Carbon dioxide removal, and that could be largely technological. Solar radiation modification, which is where we modify how much sunlight is getting onto the surface of the planet, and the marine environment. In addition, we have the nature-based solutions that we've begun to utilize, like mangrove replanting and other things. So when we begin to look at, for example, these marine climate techniques, we've got enhanced weathering and ocean alkalization, which means adding buffer to the ocean, mineralization of injected CO2 within geologic structures, microalgal cultivation, this is algae cultivation, ocean fertilization with iron, putting liquid CO2, so converting carbon dioxide, one of the greenhouse gases, to a liquid and pumping that down to the mid to deep oceans in the seabed and sediments, much like we're currently dumping sewage into La Thala Bay. Crop residue and ocean carbon sequestration. So that would be putting crop residues down into the marine environment. Marine cloud brightening, which would be a way of making our clouds brighter, which would reflect more sunlight. Surface albedo modification, ocean carbon capture and storage. All of these have serious problems for our marine environments and have serious repercussions. So on the right side of this slide, you see what some of the common governance challenges might be and what some of the specific Pacific governance challenges might be. But what I'd like to emphasize is the degree to which this conversation is ongoing with very little Pacific voice. So this is modification. This slide just looks at modifying the incoming sunlight. And you can see just with this, it gets relatively complicated as well. So what we've done in the Pacific is host a number of meetings on geoengineering to begin to engage in this conversation. But those meetings were held in as long ago as 2013. And so the outcomes of that meeting were that we have intense international mitigation efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this is very much in line with the Pacific leadership, and that reducing the emissions is a first priority. We need to go there first before going to these technological climate or geoengineering options. There needs to be more research, awareness, and transparent debate about climate engineering. And this needs to happen in the Pacific context as well, and with Indigenous voices at the table. Climate and geoengineering technologies should not be implemented until they can be proven to be sufficiently safe option for all potentially affected, and that the regulatory and enforceable governance structures are needed before any significant field testing and implementation. And in trying to address this, a number of us, including Viliamu Iese, who's speaking next, and Penihora Lafala, who's in New Zealand, have written a number of papers looking at the climate and geoengineering perspectives. But this is of some urgency because right now we have 2 noteworthy developments. And that one is that the US National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine just published a study on solar geoengineering, not all types of geoengineering, but just the solar management, managing the sunlight coming in. And it calls on the US government to establish a research program of 100 to 200 million for the duration of 5 years. And so that's really calling on the scientific community to establish the safety. But from the very beginning, we need to make sure that we follow the human rights principles of free, prior, and informed consent. And while this meeting was hosted in 2013, our voices are yet to be heard in the manner of this free, prior, and informed consent. And there's a solar engineering field experiment that a Harvard scientist, David Keith, and his colleagues have been planning now for years. And this is why the Arctic was highlighted. And it was supposed to take place in northern Sweden in June 2020, but it was canceled over public opposition and based on an open letter by Swedish organizations opposing the experiment. And so that argues that we in the Pacific might have a chance to continue to raise our voices and change the outcomes. And with apologies for my technological glitches, nakavakalevu. And I look forward to engaging in the questions and hearing the words of our other speakers. Naka.
Thank you.
Fabulous.
Thank you very much, Professor Holland. And I do apologize if my face showed a bit of almost horror when I heard you talk about the impacts of this technology. We also had a younger person in the audience in Suva speak about the military earlier today, and one imagines the applications for military purposes too could also be something to be very concerned about, not just environmental. But we'll have some questions later in the session on your presentation. We will go now though to our next speaker, Mr. Lau Viliamu Iese, and he's also coming from the University of the South Pacific, the Pacific Center for Environment and Sustainability Development. And I understand your topic will be around linking between culture and technology and such. So Lau, the floor is yours.
Yeah, talo falava and malo soifu everyone. Thank you for this the opportunity to speak to you all. Yes, you can call me Vili. I'm a Matai from Samoa, a citizen of Tuvalu, resident of Fiji, and I have been to all your countries, all the countries in Pacific Islands, so from the North and the South Pacific. I think it's the nature of my work here in the University of South Pacific and Pacific Center, so we reach all the countries of the Pacific. So I am very happy to be here. I'm also the chairperson for the research pillar of the Pacific Soil Partnership. So if you are interested in soil research, you let me know so I can connect you as well. What I am speaking about today will be briefly just a reminder to us all about the culture of resilience. And then I only have, I think, 10 minutes to speak. So then just briefly looking at some of the lessons learned and some knowledge gaps when we look at technologies and us. When I say us, meaning people and the environment, we cannot differentiate the two. I always want to start to talk about the culture of resilience to remind us about the ability of our ancestors. They had what we call the anticipatory capacity. They anticipated all sorts of risks and then they prepared accordingly. And then what I'm going to talk about now are just a bit of examples of that anticipatory capacity. So about 3,000 years ago or more, people from about Southeast Asia decided to sail eastward to look for lands. And this brave group of people sent us very important messages to think about today. That is anticipating the risk and act accordingly to address it. First, before the journey, they anticipated that the weather, there will be a lot of hardships. They will face rough seas, stormy weather, strong currents. And how did they prepare themselves? They built seaworthy canoes that rolled with the currents and managed to withstand strong storms. And the early navigators who came to the Pacific, like Roskruge and those guys, and they call those designs some of the very best they have ever seen. So, and secondly, they also anticipated a long journey, a long trip. So they perfected the art of storage of water, food preservation, navigational skills, reading the stars, fermenting or drying and processing all the foods, and also learning how to fish and survive on these canoes. So no matter how long the journeys were, they managed to sustain themselves. And lastly, they also anticipated landing. Our ancestors did not just sail for the sake of enjoying the view or getting any more suntan than they were. They were explorers, very brave explorers, and they were looking for new lands. So they anticipated landing and they prepared accordingly. Backing livestock, they took the seeds of taro and then the yams, the planting material, and they also took the knowledge with them. The knowledge of how to plant giant swamp taro in the worst soil on earth on atolls. And then the knowledge of how to cultivate the crops, how to fish, and even how to cook and eat them. And also knowledge of medicines, on how to look after each other. And when they landed, they managed to start all over again and then rebuild societies. And if you doubt that story, I am one of the great grandchildren of those navigators of the greatest blue ocean. The anticipatory risk, and if we think about that, there were three important things that enabled them to do that. One, they had the appropriate knowledge, the relevant knowledge in order to build a canoe. They had the technology, the right technology at the time in order to do a perfect design. They anticipated what was going to happen. They knew that the sea is going, and they knew the technology was there. They also had the capacity to do that. They had some trees from there to build these canoes, and they had that vision. And most importantly, in the whole anticipatory capacity of our ancestors, the underlying foundation principle is living in harmony with the environment. They did not anticipate to destroy and damage the environment. And then based on that as well, they also anticipated the connectivity of the land and the sea, the people, the sky, and everything there, both human and both the living and also the non-living. And that vision from our forefathers, if we think clearly about it today, it's missing. There is something wrong with us. The culture of resilience has been missing for a bit. You can argue as much as you want, or you can kick all your legs, but if I ask you if you still know how to navigate between Southeast Asia and Samoa using the stars, or you build a canoe like that, even myself, I even get seasick on the boats. So the most important thing in this talk is trying to look within ourselves and then see how could we rebuild that strength from within. Because if we invest in our resilience and prepare accordingly, like the way our forefathers and foremothers did, I am sure we will be okay. And part of that is all links as well to what the advocacy role, as what Professor Holland was talking about. Now, let me just bring it back to the different normals. So I was talking about 3,000, 4,000, depending on the available information. But there's also looking at this graph here that was presented by one friend of mine. It's just a view of the difference between the carbon dioxide concentration, the temperature our forefathers sailed in and farmed in and fished in, compared to the challenge we are facing now. So as they say that climate change is unprecedented. And then if we think about it, the knowledge our forefathers have accumulated all these years were mainly the knowledge to face climate variability, to face extremes, cyclone. But I do not know whether it could face cyclone, 20 cyclones within a year, or the rising sea level of 5 meters or 10 meters. So it's very important for us to realize this, because the new normal is starting now, and climate change is one of the many multipliers. We have seen this in the COVID-19, social and human risks, all the other violence, family violence, and things like that. The CEO of the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Tonga, she asked me a question when I was talking about resilience. She said, Vili, would a person care about cyclones if they only have 5 pa'anga in their pockets? Or would they care about building a cyclone-proofing house if family violence and gender-based violence still happening? And then I said, well, it's very important. We have to address those poverty issues, and we have to address those gender-based issues in the middle of addressing climate change as part of our way to address climate change. But I always say then I said to the Honorable CEO, if someone can build a church of $5 million without government support or any aid, self-fundraising, that is the culture of resilience. If we invest on the life after death, and then we use that energy to invest in the lives we are living now, like the way our forefathers did, I am sure we can do this. So if we're looking at that change, then we need technologies, we need the capacity, we need the knowledge in order to bring from the climate variability, the old normal, to the new normal, and also to address other normals, because they keep changing, record-breaking heat almost every year, the temperature. So that is something we have to deal with. The University of South Pacific is a regional center for technology needs assessment in the Pacific. And this is a global partnership with the Denmark Technical University and UNEP. And we are in TNA 3 and TNA 4 now. So we had 3 countries in the TNA 3, and now we have 5 countries in TNA 4, the technology need assessment. And in all of these technologies, we see a diversity. And most of them, for example, in the agriculture sector, are based or founded on our indigenous knowledge, diversity of crops, health of the soil, health of the ecosystem, reach to reef, and then all of these seed preservation, food preservation, they're all based on this the indigenous knowledge, and there's quite a diversity. I can tell you more about it later on, but there are some lessons I want to share as well. From the research and from the understanding now, the loss and damages on indigenous communities of climate change is understudied. There is a good progress, there is a recognition. As Professor Holland mentioned, that was 2013, that workshop, but there is still a need of more investment in it. And most of the loss and damage measurements are in the form of economic losses. It's very hard to invest or to get money on measuring how people feel, or measure the non-economic losses, the loss of culture, the loss of your totem trees or the fish. And then the impacts of climate change on indicators of traditional knowledge is also limited. We all say traditional knowledge is important, but it's good to know at which traditional knowledge that are still relevant now in a changing climate. Because I tell you this, I have been observing the breadfruit tree outside my house, because we have a traditional knowledge of using the number of breadfruits on the tree as a forecast tool for cyclones. And I started in 2015. So all three during the cyclones, during the breadfruit season, TC winds and heat. And there were changes. And sometimes when the forecast says the cyclone will come to Suva, I check my breadfruit tree and it's only 1 fruit on it or 2. And then I say, no, it will not come to Suva. So it was right from 2015. So the index 1, 2, 3 was correct all along, except the beginning of this year. So at the beginning of this year, I was checking the breadfruit tree. There was no fruit. And then I said, okay, what is happening to my tree? And then the cyclone came very close to Suva, called Kandavu, and then came very close to Suva. So the changes, so the knowledge of 1, 2, 3 is now changing. So now it's what happens if there is no breadfruit at all on the tree? So how climate change, increasing of temperature, increasing of CO2, increasing of sea level, ocean, acidification, and ocean temperature affect the indicators. Our forefathers and our communities relied on those indicators to read the weather and then acted accordingly. But now when one flower appears, the fish that's supposed to appear at the same time is not appearing. So the younger generators, like what the Laughing Samoan says, the younger generations are actually not believing the traditional knowledge because of that. So there is a mismatch, and how much mismatch is something we are not yet known. So, and that is something we need to prioritize. The impacts of climate adaptation and mitigation technologies on indigenous people is also limited. Most of the effectiveness of adaptation and the study is related to whether it addresses climate change, whether it stops a drought or reduces the impacts of a drought. But it doesn't really talk about how it impacts the access of the people to their resources, whether the availability of those traditional resources. And I'm using seawalls here as an example because it's quite a very popular example in the Pacific. Build a seawall in order to protect the coastal erosion and saltwater inundation. But at the same time, in some designs, they stop the people from accessing or carrying their canoe to the sea. So it limits that access from the land to the sea. And some of the seawalls they already built without considering this. So they end up breaking down the seawall to allow the fishermen and the fisherwomen to access. And then I say, in what world they design that without considering this? And some of the seawall is one of those examples that the solution could cause more problems than the original issue tried to address. I'm not saying seawalls are bad. It can be really good as seen by other countries. But our seawalls, when the donor say it's $10,000 seawall, we all jump up and build a $10,000 seawall. And that seawall, one small wave, and then the whole thing gone. So the impact of these technologies on people and the environment is very much needed. So the way forward, there is a need to understand the impacts of climate change and technologies on indigenous people and their environments. And there is a need to increase the prioritization of indigenous people and systems in research. When I talk about research, I talk about mitigation and adaptation research. Sometimes we always ignore the system focused approach of our traditional system. And also there's a need to include indigenous people and system in the technology needs assessment. So this is something new that we are looking at it now. It has been recognized suddenly that but we do need to include indigenous people and their views and how to engage them within the technology need assessment and approaches. So the technology need assessment project that we are working with is now developing a guide of how to engage indigenous people in technology need assessment processes. So in identifying technology, prioritizing technology, looking at barrier analysis and enabling framework, and also the technology action plans, because these are linked to the Green Climate Fund and all those financing mechanisms there. So this is, I think to myself, it's a good step to the right direction. But I have advised the people who are developing the guide to ensure indigenous people are involved in the development of the guide. So I think that is needed to be to be understood. So, and the other thing, I think we really need to look at a systemic approach. We look at the people and the environments. Sometimes we talk about the human rights, it's the human rights. We talk about understanding the impacts of climate change on people. But I just want us to remember again, the way our forefathers and foremothers did, we do not separate ourselves, the people, from the land and the sea and the sky. If we look back to our origins, if we look back to our origins and our legends, the man came from the earth. So there is a very strong connection between us. And I want to end it with Aristotle, that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. There are a lot of sectoral approaches, and the UN and all the development partners highly contribute to it. So the sectoral approach, this is a UN organization that look after agriculture. This is the group that look after health. This is the group, and then it mirrors all the way down, maybe all the way down to the government level. And sometimes there is no one to look after indigenous people and the environment. So just think about it. And going back to the anticipating risks, just reach inside your own, think about it. that resilience has to come from within, and we have to rediscover it. Or we, as we say in rugby, it's either you use it or lose it. So that is all from my corner. And and thank you very much. Now, valeu.
Kia ora lau. You know, you gave some really good examples of the bigger risk, which is we have technology that might be used for climate crisis, mitigating and adapting, but like your example of the seawall, if the Indigenous peoples who are affected on site aren't consulted and we don't have free, prior, informed consent about these technologies, then something like a seawall could disrupt our, you know, entire practice of moving between the land and the ocean. That's just one small example, but it could be replicated in so many different ways. So thank you for reminding us of that, and the fact that we have technology. Indigenous peoples have our own technology, and we need to integrate that with the Western technologies to make sure it's in alignment with Mother Nature, who Mother Nature is actually the superior technology. Let's face it, we can't beat her at her own game. We wouldn't want to, but we have to make sure that's how the technology does in fact roll out. So thank you. And our final speaker for this session before we go to Q&A is Dr. Nick Roskruge, Professor in Ethnobotany, School of Agriculture and Environment here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So Nick, we'll hand to you for some thoughts on technology and its role in climate crisis mitigation and adaptation. Thank you.
Hey, o kirana tata mi atu. Mo tēnei rā, my name is Nick Roskruge, and I am based at Massey University, which is an agricultural university here in Aotearoa. I'm a professor of ethnobotany, but in reality, I'm a soil scientist by training, but I work with farmers, and it's about farmer development as my key activity, I guess you could say. And while I'm based here at Massey, I work with our foreign affairs, so a lot of farmer training post-cyclone. We've got the Kana project in Fiji out at Koro, and then another project not long finished out of PNG, and another one in Niue. But before that, I used to work with crop germplasm programs based out of CIP in Peru, which is where all the root crops, a lot of the original germplasm comes from, and the people look after those materials. So we're involved with indigenous communities, being able to collect and gather and hold those plants, mostly kumara, kumala and potato, those sort of crops, for future access, if you like. And on top of that, more recently with work with FAO and different food security type projects, which are slowly starting to take notice of the Pacific a bit more than they used to. Still not ideal, but the conversations are starting to happen. What I thought I'd do today was take you for a walk from a farmer perspective. So rather than from the academic world, which is where a lot of us sit, but from the on the ground perspective, which is where we spend, or where I spend most of my time. I'm also the chairman for what's known as Tahuri Whenua here in New Zealand. It's the National Māori Horticultural Collective, and some of this draws on the activity at that land level, at the whenua, because really that's where the opportunity to ensure our future generations have the life that we currently enjoy, and we want to ensure that we maintain the resources for that purpose. So let's start that conversation, shall we? And I think you've heard from the previous speakers about Indigenous knowledge, the role of Indigenous knowledge, and it's a catchphrase that's out there at the moment. Traditional knowledge versus Indigenous knowledge. What is the role? How is it applied? And we understand, and we all do that it's taken generations of knowledge evolution to get to this point. But our biggest issue at the moment is that the next generations that are coming through are starting to occupy a new world. And that new world brings other knowledge systems to compete with the Indigenous knowledge system. So one of our it's an opportunity, but it's also a threat, is how do we ensure that the Indigenous knowledge is handed over, is appropriate, and that it has that dynamic response to what's going on at the moment, and that our young people can take it on board and use it appropriately. So, you know, one of the biggest issues we see, and this is across the whole Pacific, is the movement of the young people to the towns. And COVID has been a good example of now their jobs have gone, they've come back to the village, but they don't have the knowledge that would ordinarily be there for them to be part of village life and to be part of the process. So how do we ensure that the knowledge which our older generations currently hold, how do we ensure that that's handed over appropriately and in time? The other thing is that most knowledge is specific to place. Is that while we talk about knowledge in a big capture for everything, most of it is specific to place. It's location, it's the climate, for example, in Ra in Fiji is different to the climate in Nandi in Fiji, you know, and the soils are different. All of those elements are contributors to the Indigenous knowledge by place. So part of the challenge is how do we ensure that what we have, what remains with us, is able to be handed over appropriately and to be able to be applied appropriately. So the basis of that knowledge remains the whenua, our relationship with the natural resources, but we need to understand how we can ensure that it can be applied or adapted as appropriate. So the question was asked, what is the role of science in technology? Now, science to me is a term that is about the development of new knowledge. So all those people that say they're scientists are all in a process of trying to add something to the current knowledge base. No? Technology is how we apply that knowledge. It's the next phase. What do we do with the science? If I undertake some science that looks at storage of a crop, and we manipulate, say, the temperature of the storage, and we come up with a recipe for the future, we then have to work out how we apply that recipe in a day-to-day basis. There's the technology jump, if you like. So science and technology must complement each other. They draw from each other to go forward. The same for what people might call Indigenous science. Indigenous science is science, whether it's where it draws from is labeling something. It's knowledge. It's about knowledge that was drawn from experience, from repeated observations, all of those processes. So it's a part of that recipe of both science and technology. Our task is how we interpret it and how we understand it for our situation. How do we take that learning, that knowledge, whether it's learning from past generations, whether it's learning from the last few years, how do we take it, interpret it, understand it, and apply it consistently? So that's the task on the ground. The other word that was sort of put in front of me was this word sustainability. And sustainability is a catchphrase, certainly in the science arena, it's appearing often in science communications and what have you. But how many people actually understand what sustainability means? There's another word coming in now called regenerative agriculture. What does that mean? And for most people, even the term organic, when you talk about organic agriculture, for most people, they have a very personal opinion about what these words mean. And then for the professional sector, they have another interpretation or opinion. So what do these words mean? And do they affect what should be happening? Sustainability, by its very nature, is not something that should happen at the cost to the resource itself. So when you're talking about sustainability, you're talking about the very minimum is maintaining the status quo, and beyond that is improving it to a standard that meets your expectations as the people who draw from that resource. That means you need to understand the full system. What is happening on that? So if we take a block of land, a piece of whenua, what's happening on that land? What's the inputs, what's the outputs? How do we understand the relationship between all of those factors? If climate change is our biggest issue, what is it about climate change for the local community that is the biggest issue? Is it the timing of the weather events? Is it the extent of the weather events? Is it flooding rather than heat waves? What is it that's coming into play? And how can science and technology support the response? It's not saying they will support it, but how, as the person living on the whenua, how would you look to scientists, or would you look to technology to be able to respond to those issues? So I guess what I'm saying is that we need to ask ourselves what we think sustainability means in the sense of our view of the resource that we draw from, and how do we use all of those tools around us, which include science and technology, to help achieve sustainability from our perspective. And in this case, we're certainly looking at it from an Indigenous perspective. What needs to change? What needs to be adapted, or what needs to be adopted? They're all different relationships with future inputs to our system, to the tools we might bring in. So we're talking sustainability. What is the impact on our natural resource, on the values and the culture that we have with that resource? If we look to technology to help support us through pressure on our natural resource, what does that technology do? How does it respect the knowledge systems, those people that don't have an option but to draw from this resource, so to grow crops where they're not limited and where they can move those crops to? What are your choices? And what opportunity does that technology offer to the culture? How does it add value? Everything, you can do the glass half full thing. You can look at something and say, it's just a cost to our system, or you can look at it and see what is the opportunity and make that opportunity more important than any other factor. What are the dynamics of change if we bring technology into our system? Does it usurp current practice? Does it change something? What does it do to our current system? So understanding the impact of change, this is where technology comes in. What about the costs of intervention, the time it takes to bring in technology, the logistics? If you're not on the main road, if you have access, it can only be during the dry season rather than the wet season. And more, what about the ongoing management? I've seen post-cyclone, I've seen NGOs deliver equipment to the regions that can't be fixed because there's no local suppliers to fix with parts, or it requires fuel and all of that, and there's no funding to be able to fuel it all the time. So what are the ongoing management needs? What's the real opportunity look like? I was also, in that big context of thing, we're talking about sustainability. What is about this term for renewable energy? What does renewable mean? And by definition, renewable means that something was there in the first place. For some reason, it's been diminished and then it's being renewed. There has to be a cost to be able to achieve something in that context. What are the costs of renewable energy? I'm particularly interested in crop production and food systems. So energy has a particularly high value because it's used to support the supply of water, for example, to support the production of high quality planting materials, which are ways of getting a better output from your system. It can support access to information, which is one of the key drivers for the future. We can, through the use of phones or internet, we can access information just like that. And it can support our decision-making process, how we respond to the variables that are affecting our system. So we definitely want to take advantage of energy systems, but how do we make sure it's not at the cost of our environment that we currently access? So in other words, what does it take from the system to achieve this term renewable? And then how do we mitigate the issues that are already there? How do we balance the system? Do we know what the system should look like? Or do we know parts of the system? You've just heard that the whole is worth more than the parts of the system. And that's true, because the value overall is in the whole system being able to work together. It's like owning a car. If only one part of the motor works, the car won't go anywhere. So you need the whole system to work together to be able to take you to the other venue, if you like. What are the alternatives to your current system? So if you can't produce your food needs close to the village, for example, within walking distance, what's the alternatives? Where do you go? What's the cost of change? You've still got to negotiate with other landowners if something like that comes into be. How does that, if you were to mitigate that change, how would that come true? And I've put a term there, what is the strategic scenario? While we look at today, and we should also be looking at 5 years' time, 10 years' time, and at least having a concept plan in our space to determine where we think we should be. We don't know exactly what climate and other factors will bring to us, but we need to have some strategy in mind to be able to look after our people and be able to take them forward. So what is the strategic scenario going forward? So the restoration, from my point of view, of traditional processes and practices is important. And I say restoration because in many cases, there's a few people that are applying their traditional ways, but in many cases, they're being sort of imposed upon by more modern ways. If I take Fiji, for example, and I want to go and buy seed for a crop, say tomatoes or eggplants and what have you, I don't have a lot of choices where I can go and buy that seed. And often that seed is not from, not grown locally, so it doesn't have a, in my concept, a whakapapa of local origin, which is the first issue in itself, and that you're bringing in plant material that may or may not grow well in your area. So what will it take to support traditional horticulture? What technology would we like to see that ensures both the producers and the families who have to rely on food production in rural Pacific are properly supported? And what is the role of the external agency and other individuals to come in to ensure that that happens? Some examples here, just soil conservation. I trained as a soil scientist, so I have a particular interest in soil, but how do we, for example, with that strategic view, look to plant to reduce runoff from especially coastal sort of impacts of weather events, the incursion of salt water into previously planted areas, which is becoming more and more common? What about our crop choices? Germplasm is a term used for local varieties being retained as a collection so that people can access those local varieties. So take taro, for example, ondalo. If you keep a sample of your local varieties, not for commercial growth, but for you to access as the local community, then that's your germplasm collection. That becomes your bank. And what about the specialist activity? What about people within the community having specialized inputs rather than everybody trying to do the same thing? So nursery behavior, and that's our project on Koro is looking at that, for example, at having 1 or 2 nurseries that just grow the seedlings. The introduced technology has to have support systems around it. So if we have equipment, if we have people that come to bring that technology out to the community, they need to be trained. They need to be able to follow that through. And the last point I've put there, and I think it's probably the most important, is that education and training at all levels is the tool forward, and that we need to continue to educate ourselves about how we survive in the system we have, how we need to work that system going forward. So education and training are the most important. So we need to let science and technology support local knowledge. It's important that we prioritize. Yep. Capture that knowledge in its form, rebuild the skills and strategic knowledge, consider long-term effects, consider long-term options, consider the role of NGOs and look at that for the three ranges of management: operational, tactical, and strategic. Me atu kia koutou.
Kia ora, Nick. That was very insightful, especially I think you've hit it on the button there about what actually is our concept of sustainability, or even beyond sustainability now, because our environment is in many ways in deficit. The sixth mass extinction of biodiversity on the planet is now something that is a phrase that is used and more familiar with. So we've actually got to move beyond sustainability. But in the earlier session, we talked about how gross domestic product is a very, very poor way of measuring whether our nations and communities are doing well. So we should be moving to a framework which shows better about well-being. And again, we come back to like our Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples for our human rights. If we are achieving and realizing those rights, what better framework would there be for well-being than that? And also reminded of the use of technology in India, when you talk about agriculture, genetically modified organisms, and how many small farmers bought seed that was genetically modified. They used it, they got in this debt trap with having to repurchase seeds again and again, and that led to thousands, hundreds of thousands of small farmers in India committing suicide because there was no way out of the debt. So this idea about technology and its use and ensuring free, prior and informed consent by Indigenous peoples is very, very important. So thank you very much. So now we'll move on to the Q&A part of this session. I'll just turn it over to Rob in the room in Suva to see if we have any questions from our audience.
Yep, thanks, Catherine. Are there any questions in the room? Maybe while we're warming up, I didn't see any questions online, but maybe we could pull a question from the questions posed yesterday. Thank you.
Now is Rob there? Because I can see one from yesterday that might be quite relevant here.
Yes, great. Thank you.
Great. So I'll read this one out. The question from yesterday is this. In terms of intellectual property and the struggles of operating across different dialects, values, and ethnicities, how does the Pacific, separated by geography and intangible barriers, contend with private companies looking to copyright and patent our native, I think he means native plants? And we can also think of other traditional knowledge and our native sciences, this kind of information. The imperative is to bring them together with Western science and blend it in a way for climate crisis mitigation adaptation that's the best. But in doing that, we're putting our traditional knowledge kind of at risk. And I think that's the gist of this question. How do we protect our Indigenous knowledge from, say, companies coming and taking it and misusing it or using it for profit or whatever they intend to do? That's a big question. So I'd like to put that to our panelists for anyone who might have a response to that. May I start with Professor Holland? Do you have a perspective on that?
Yes. The question was intellectual property and how we're maybe putting our Indigenous knowledge at risk. Is the fundamental thing? I think this issue of Indigenous knowledge and the appropriate protections is really a critical one. It's one that Indigenous peoples all over the world are trying to deal with. And some of that knowledge has a specific climate context, and as the context of the climate, shifting temperatures, shifting precipitation, shifting seasonality, shifting interactions between the ocean and the atmosphere, all of that begins to put the Indigenous knowledge at risk. And it's not, and my fear is that in some of the conversations, the way that Indigenous knowledge may be put at risk also is a mechanism for invalidating Indigenous knowledge from some perspectives. And I just raise that because I think it's very important that we protect the integrity of Indigenous knowledge and the cultural as well as the climate context in which it's generated. And I'm not a specialist in intellectual property law. I'm not a lawyer. I'm only a research scientist who's a bit obsessed about the climate. So I hope that was helpful to generate some other insights, because I'm sure other people have more thoughtful insights than I do.
Kia ora, Dr. Holland, that certainly provoked me to think. We talk about intellectual property, but that whole question of whether that is a good way to protect, it's a Western thinking of how to protect Indigenous knowledge, right? It's not our own ways that we protect Indigenous knowledge by keeping it alive, by living it day to day. And so we have to even question, well, do we want our knowledge to be located inside a Western legal kind of space for protecting it? Because many of these protections run out. They have a shelf life of like a number of years, and then once those years have elapsed, then anybody can use the knowledge, so it's not really protecting it. So there are many questions around that. Is there any response, Nick, that you'd like to make to that question? It is a bit technical legally, but still there might be some other thought that you have around protecting Indigenous knowledge.
Well, kia ora anō. I'll just add a couple of points. I guess one is that there's a whole movement now around what they call data sovereignty. So there's a whole lot of people, Indigenous included, around how to manage what's ours, what is Indigenous. And it's not my space, it's not my expertise, but there are people starting to look at how that works from an Indigenous driver. From my perspective, and it's, I'm not 21 anymore, so it's something that's sort of from the last 60 or 70 years, is that we have to own our space. We have to be prepared to steer the ship, if you like, and keep the sharks from circling. So that means that somewhere from within, we have to create our systems of ensuring the knowledge that is ours is appropriately sort of handled and taken forward. The old people, where I come from in Taranaki, when the Europeans first came, they manipulated their knowledge so that they only handed over parts of what they knew, and they knew that because it was only parts of it, it wouldn't be a valuable outcome for the people. So they lost interest in trying to gain what it was our people had. The worry for us is that our generations have passed and they haven't had the opportunity to hand over to their children or their grandchildren in the form that they would like to. The modern world puts a whole lot of pressure on people for a whole lot of other reasons, and that's around trying to keep your families fed and keep the bills paid and all of those sorts of things. And people have sort of put the knowledge system a little bit to the side. So how do we own that space? How do we, as Māori, Pacifica, whomever, how do we own the space from the inside? And that's probably the most important point. It's empowerment. It's about working out and moving away from the reliance on another system to tell us how to take it forward. Not easy. There is no single answer, but it's something we have to own from the inside. That would be my sort of key thoughts.
Kia ora, Nick. And that reminds me that low tech, compared with what Western science might think of high levels of technology, actually builds in resilience. If you go, we've already talked about, if you go too far down the technology, you may leave our communities open to more vulnerability. Like you said, there's an example of bringing some technology into a village, say, maybe it's a tractor and it breaks down, but we've gotten so used to using the tractor that when it breaks down and we can't fix it, we're left you know, looking around going, oh, what do we do now? And we've forgotten our traditional knowledge because we haven't been practicing it, because we moved to another kind of knowledge. So we're grappling with these. And I just wanted to say, there is a food security summit, a UN food security summit that is coming up later this year. And believe me, there will be decisions made, government policy influences there. If we're not at that table, we will be on the menu, is my concern. And our technologies that we have are important in those spaces, not just because we offer something of value to create resilience, but because they could be appropriating our knowledge, weaving it into whatever plans they have without our consent. So those spaces like that, I'm really concerned that Indigenous peoples of the Pacific need to have voices there. But I'll turn now to you, Lo. Did you have any thoughts about knowledge protection, while at the same time it seems like an oxymoron? We have to, you know, give our knowledge to the world in some respects, but also protect and control it. So your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the most humbling experience of my young research life is when I went to Tuvalu to do a research on collecting traditional knowledge of farmers who plant the giant swamp taro on the atolls. And these traditional knowledge are very specific. It's also very family specific, and it was a secret for the family itself, so they didn't want to share it. But given that I'm Samoan, not a Tuvaluan at the time, and I'm also very what shall I say, easy to talk to for the farmers, so they share their knowledge with me. But I promised them that I will not publish their knowledge in my thesis at the time. So I summarized the knowledge, and then I didn't publish it in my thesis, but somebody stole my thesis from the library because they thought that it got the traditional knowledge of planting the giant swamp taro. But the farmers I spoke to, they wanted the general knowledge sufficient enough for the younger generation of Tuvalu to plant a giant swamp taro and harvest a good one. But the specific of the knowledge that they use for competition, because they have NAFA to compete with each other, that remains a secret. It's a family secret. So what I am trying to say is that I totally agree with the clash, but it is also coming down to setting up the mechanisms that is not just international level. It is also within the country, within the responsibility of us researchers, because sometimes it is the researchers that leak this knowledge. There's a very good case in Samoa from the Mamala case with the traditional medicine that was taken out by a researcher or somebody who asked the traditional healer about it. So it comes from within, and that personal responsibility. If you go as a researcher, you must know your boundaries, and then you know the rules of that, and that's an ethical thing to do. And when I say that it's a personal relation, it's a personal responsibility, because it also comes with systems in universities to make sure we have these systems in place to safeguard the knowledge of our people, and then putting that in place. Also at the national level, are our laws sufficient to protect it? Because it is happening, but we don't have laws to take the people to court. And also the international laws, is it sufficient? Or is it like a shark that doesn't have teeth? Or like it just looks very scary, but it doesn't eat anyone, it just go and eat it. So is the international law protecting other countries rather than the people, than the indigenous people? I'm saying this because there are clashes. The Convention of Biological Diversity, there is also access benefit sharing. So on one hand, we say informed consent, and then the other hand, we say like share your genetic material for help to save the world. And then you have the access and benefit sharing responsibilities. And then we have the World Trade Organization that is also coming down on this. So having this understanding of the multiple levels of challenges require all of us to work together, and all of us to have a responsibility. So when we have the chance to speak about it at a table, as Catherine mentioned, when we have the chance to speak, talk about it. And when we have the chance to practice, do it. Don't wait for someone else to come and do it. So I think it's the overall conversation to have, and the intellectual property right is not foreign versus indigenous. Even the indigenous people themselves are the ones who are doing it. So I think we have to safeguard our mechanisms and look within ourselves. We set everything from our institutions, our universities, our education system, and then have the advocacy all the way to the international level. Thank you.
Thank you, kia ora Lo, for that. And I just wanted to read a chat comment / question in the box, which relates to this, just to make sure we've answered the question there. And it says Pacific scholars such as Dr. Kanaihelu Thaman echoes Pacific perspectives when saying that our version of sustainable development is cultural continuity. However, most of our cultural skills are kept secret within family clans because some Pacific Islanders don't want to lose their intellectual property rights. Our knowledge is considered sacred and has what we call AAO, which is the Melanesian Polynesian equivalent of mana. Oh, so that's ao, the word is ao, the equivalent of mana, and authority, I would say that might be referring to. Hence, most Marshallese are reluctant to share their knowledge because they feel it will diminish their knowledge's ao or mana or authority and sacredness. But the negative side is that traditional knowledge becomes lost if you don't share it out and lose it. So how do you think we should protect and conserve our Indigenous knowledge without having our knowledge being abused by Western academia and Western sources in general? So I think we partly answered that question. It also relates to the recommendations in earlier sessions that we need to get our knowledge into school curriculums, but in doing so, we've got to think about all of this. You know, there's a balance to be struck. How much knowledge do we give out? How much do we hold back? Because it's sacred. So thank you for that online comment. I'd like to go back to the room in Suva to see if we haven't provoked any more questions just from this conversation we had just now. Any questions coming from our family?
Any questions from the floor for our panelists? Yeah, coming over.
Thank you so much to the presenters for the comprehensive presentation. I think I just have one question. This is with regards to intellectual property. I believe that participants in this room, especially women from Wainganake and also Indigenous people as a whole, I feel like if we truly understand the concept around intellectual property, there will be a time that we will just not want to share what we know, especially our knowledge, also in these kind of spaces, because I feel like at a certain point, if we finally do, how do you capture the traditional knowledges that, you know, that we're trying to harness for the benefit of our future generation? I'm a firm believer in LEDLA, local agenda led by local actors. Thank you.
I'd like to just pick up on that. We're talking about development of whole nations, preservation of the whole planet. We're talking about a process line that completes. And I think it comes back to mutuality, that the Indigenous people have been advantaged and benefited by progress, development. In exchange, they impart the knowledge and the wisdom that helps those who are migrating and sharing the environment cooperate with preservation of the environment. And when our development becomes mutual, then we will mature, all of us together. Thank you.
Any more further comments or questions from the floor? Any questions? We have for the panelists. Yeah, in the chat box.
If I might just drop in there, Rob, I totally agree with our colleague there from the floor. In the previous session, we talked about inequality. So if this sharing was reciprocal, between Indigenous peoples and those that come into our lands and territories, all good if that's, you know, a fair exchange. But what we found is it has not been a fair exchange. So that's the big question. So I just thought I'd mention that. And also just to let people know, I'm happy to share information about a claim here in Aotearoa, which is all about traditional Indigenous knowledge and protecting that knowledge. And it's a claim that was filed in the 80s with a commission of inquiry here in New Zealand. Some may be familiar. It's the Waitangi Tribunal. And it's a commission of inquiry that looks at the relationship between Māori and the Crown throughout history. And this particular claim is about flora and fauna, traditional knowledge, and it was actually kicked off because of some of our kumara tubers were taken to Japan for research. And we did not agree to that. We did not. So our elders, women they were, went to Japan and got them back, brought them back to New Zealand. But that sparked off a whole range of questions about our traditional knowledge and how are we protecting it all. And still today, what are we, 2021, we still haven't resolved that claim in its fullness with our government and all the agencies that have our knowledge somehow, somewhere in use. So we need to make use of these mechanisms, but it's a long game. But I'm happy to share some information about that claim, which is still ongoing today. Thank you. Do we have any comments from our panel at this time?
Oh, kia ora, no, Catherine, that as it turns out, I'm on the kaumātua rōpū for that claim, so we're still trying to make sure it works from a Māori perspective, which it still hasn't quite got there. But it's an example, and this is for those there on the floor, is that from a Māori perspective, traditional knowledge has different layers. He tātai nei, there are people that are exposed to the more senior layers, which is that which connects us to our gods and to all of that knowledge that flows through there. And there are people that are connected to other layers of knowledge. So when we talk about traditional knowledge, we tend to put that all together, and it's not, in reality, that's not how it is. We have some working knowledge which we know that is reasonably familiar, and that, like it or not, it's already filtered out and people are taking advantage of it. But there is other knowledge that should never leave our space, and that is what makes us, that is our whakapapa, it is our connection. So rather than seeing it as a catch-all for everything, we need to think about the different layers of knowledge and which layers we can sort of happily mix and share. The other side of that, certainly when you work with food crops, is the gender relationship, and that, certain knowledge belongs with different age groups or with different genders within society. So again, we have repository of knowledge that's not all in one place, it's all in different spots. And I think that's one of our ways of protecting, is that we know the people that hold particular layers of knowledge have the ability to interpret how that should be shared, if it's shared at all. So it's quite a complicated space. The Y262 claim certainly raised that point about what we know about our native plants, what we know about our food plants, and the number of people that are trying to access those resources for other gains. And that's why I say we need to be stronger in how we build the fence and how we ensure that the knowledge is managed from our space. Much more difficult now with the freedom of information, how people share. Our young people have a different platform, with all of the internet and the different Twitter and what have you. And I'm not sure that we have taught them how to filter what moves out into those platforms. So maybe that's one of our starting points.
Kia ora, thank you, Nick. Good points. And I think if we start wrapping up now, but just a soundbite of any last thoughts. We've heard from Nick, Professor Holland, and then Lo, would you have any final points before we begin wrapping up the session? Thank you.
I just wanted to reiterate and reinforce what others have said about how traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge has formed the foundation for many of the principles of democracy, in fact. The Talanoa dialogue that was used so extensively in the UNFCCC following Fiji's presidency of the COP was a really good example. The foundation of the US government is based on Iroquois principles and the balance between the different houses of power. So there are many ways that don't stay acknowledged that those in power have benefited from traditional and Indigenous knowledge and have not always, or maybe only rarely, have done what you talked about, which is the co-sharing of the outcomes.
Kia ora and thank you. And Lo, any final words?
Yeah, I think I would like to end this session with just thoughts on the collective, the power of the collective. And I think you have highlighted that very well from the example from Maori and the Kumala. And also like the Hawaiians showed it as well with the taro when they stopped the breeding programs because of the use of the genetic resources of their traditional taro. And also Samoa is now still ongoing with the case to try to get back the ownership of the mamala medicine, the anti-HIV one. And then like all of this and everything that we have discussed, and also is in the core of our culture and our system, is the strength of the collective, of everybody working together. And I think if we manage to harness that one more time, or in all of these times going forth, I am sure we will make some progress and continue to build on the progress that you, Catherine, and the people who are organizing this workshop have worked really hard to do. So I think personally, I am very happy to be here because Indigenous knowledge and safeguarding Indigenous knowledge is something that I do every day, but I don't think about it much. But I think it's being part of this forum gives me the kind of lens that I have to reflect back on, adding my own stone to make sure we bring all the stones together and build our houses. The more collective we work, the more achievements or the more noise we will make, useful noise to be correct. So thank you very much and whaftai lava.
Kia ora. And with that beautiful final message, thank you to all our panelists for sharing your precious time and energy with us for this session. And thank you to those in the room and those who have offered some thoughts in the chat. We'll be winding the session up now.